Thank you everybody for joining us tonight for Singh-Ray's webinar of the month. We are going to be talking about photographing Washington's volcanoes, all in camera, of course, because that is Randall Hodges' specialty. A little bit about Randall. He has been capturing images of the Western United States and Canada as a full-time professional photographer for over 20 years. Most of his work comes from time spent hiking and backpacking in the wilderness areas of the West, where he has hiked and photographed over 33,000 trail miles. Randall's work has been published over 4,950 times worldwide in books, magazines, calendars, greeting cards, postcards, newspapers, and much more. His work has been in National Geographic, National Photographer Magazine, Northwest Travel Magazine, Oregon Coast Magazine, Seattle Magazine, just to name a few. He has won countless awards for photography, and he does not alter his work in any way. He considers himself an all-in-camera shooter, as he spends the time to wait for the right light and color and uses old school techniques rather than post-processing to capture his images. Only the smallest adjustments are made to ensure the finished print matches the back of the camera as closely as possible. His work has been featured in countless galleries and art shows around the West. He speaks at photography conventions and seminars, and he teaches his out in the field lessons and adventures around the West, where he shares his old school techniques on digital cameras with his students. He has a book, Images of the West, a 208-page full-color landscape photography book featuring 20 years of his unforgettable photography of the West. And he owns the Randall J. Hodges Photography Gallery in downtown Edmonds, Washington, and the Images of the West Gallery in beautiful Cannon Beach, Oregon. And with that, Randall, I'll let you take it.
Well done, Michelle. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to take you on a little adventure here. I appreciate you tuning in. Last month, those of you who were with us, we focused a little more on lesson format for the webinar. We're going to dive a little bit into that, but this time we're going to go a little bit more on an adventure, as I'm going to share a tale of one of my backpacking trips summer before last, to photograph all 5 of Washington's Big Five. I call them the Big Five, which is Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and Glacier Peak. Photograph all 5 of the big volcanoes in an 18-day hiking and backpacking adventure, which happened the 2nd and 3rd week of July. So let's move forward here. I'm going to talk just a little bit about camera setup. We really covered that a lot over the last webinar, but I want you to kind of have a grasp of how I do this all in camera. To start with, thanks, Michelle, for the great introduction there. I am an all-in-camera shooter, but I want to make it clear that that doesn't mean I'm a post-processing hater, or I don't like or follow photographers who do post-processing. No, I do this way because, one, it makes me happy. I always say there's only one right way in photography, and that's your way. And if your way is making you happy, then you're doing it right. This way makes me very happy to do it all in camera. And also it is how I'm unique in a world of what I would call over post-process photography. I've just switched gears and went the other way and stuck to old school film techniques, which I now do on a digital camera. I got started back in slide film and transparency days, and I've just figured out how to shoot that same style on a digital camera. So I'm not a hater of post-processing. My goal for my students is to get them as close to not needing it as possible. Just a little bit about how I shoot. I do shoot in RAW because I'll probably get that question. But to do all in-camera work and to access your camera's color features, you have to convert that RAW file in the software that came with the camera, meaning you cannot open the RAW file in Photoshop or Lightroom, as those are stripping programs, and they'll strip all the color right out of your photo there. So for me, when I've shot an image in camera, I have to do a file convert save as in the camera software. By the way, I shoot a Canon 5D SR. So for me, that's Canon's DPP4, Digital Photo Professional 4 software. I do a quick file convert save as, save it as an 8-bit TIFF. a 16-bit TIFF if I know it's going to go for a really, really, really big print. But 8-bit TIFFs off my camera make a 144 megabyte file. That's already a pretty big file. I do open it in Photoshop and dedust and check for any sensor dust I might have. I internally copyright and keyword the images, and then I'm done. For me, my whole process takes about 60 seconds a photo, which also allows me more time out in the field, less time on the computer, and I can send my publishers way more images every year. And for me, I do this for one reason. I love photography, but even more, I love to hike and backpack. So I want to be out there in the field. A little bit about my camera setup. So like I said, I access the color palettes in my camera and I set them up to mimic my old slide films. For me, that would be Kodak Elite Chrome, Kodak Ektachrome, Kodak Kodachrome, Fuji Velvia, Fuji Provia, and high contrast black and white. I'll just kind of jump in a little bit about that for a Canon camera. That means we're going to go into the picture styles and we're going to pick some of those picture styles and we're going to go one step further and we're actually going to set up stuff like sharpness, contrast, color hue, saturation, those types of things. If you were in a Nikon, that would be set up under picture control. If you were Sony, that would be creative styles or color controls. If you're Fuji, Fuji has its own rolls of film basically, but you can set those globally all at once. You can adjust the contrast, sharpness, saturation, and it'll apply to all the Fuji films in there. And very similar for Olympus and other cameras. The second thing about in-camera photography is you have to control the white balance in the camera. You cannot leave that. You can't leave that on auto. Let me do a little camera adjustment here. There we go. If you're doing that on auto, the white balance is never going to be right. Most guys who run people who run their cameras on auto, white balance will be setting that back in Photoshop or letting Photoshop determine their white balance. But for an in-camera shooter, it's critical you control the white balance in the camera. I use light bright warming polarizers. Any type of polarizer during the day would work. I prefer a light bright warming polarizer because I often think a polarizer can add a blue cast to a photo. So adding that warming element cancels out the blue cast. It's not critical anymore because you can always adjust your white balance, but for me, that's what I prefer. And I use a whole host of graduated split neutral density filters. I carry in my pack all in hard graduation, by the way. For in-camera shooting, softs just don't work. They don't trick the camera. Got to be hard graduation. I have a 1-stop, 2-stop, 3-stop, and 4-stop, all in hard graduation, and a half a stop that Singh-Ray has started making just for me. I request they make that. And then I think they've become a little popular. My students have certainly been buying some of those also. I also use the Randall Hodges Mountain V filter, which is a split neutral density filter that instead of a straight line, it creates a V. I use that up high in the mountains. When there's a V in a valley, it helps me out quite a bit. And I do have a 2-stop solid density filter that I would employ when I need a longer exposure. I don't really use density filters overall. I don't usually need longer exposures too much, but if you want to do a little bit of fun photography with density filters for 10-minute and plus exposures, you sure can. And but this episode, we're not going to focus as much on the technique as we are going to focus more on lighting, timing, composition, and how I come around making these images. We've got a lot of images to get to. So I would say this trip started a full year in advance in planning because often nowadays you need reservations at campgrounds, reservations to backpack. So at least a full year, these trips to start the planning. That's what I love about a trip. It takes a whole year to plan the trip. I take the trip and then I have the photos that last a lifetime. So really a trip lasts almost forever. So let's get this thing started. Here we go. First stop on this was Mount Rainier. This is called Grand Park. Got a couple of hikers there moving across to give a little scale. And I'm only going to hit the technique about every third or fourth photo. I really want you to see the transition of how light and composition works. This was shot aperture priority f20. You're going to see I use f18, f20, f22 almost all the time. 1/30th of a second. I use my exposure compensation to darken it by 2/3 of a stop. You're also going to notice a lot of my photos I have darkened a little bit. ISO 200 only because I needed to get those hikers frozen. Normally I would shoot at ISO 100 or 50. White balance for this is 5600K in that landscape roll of film. Whenever you hear me say landscape, that means I shot it in what I call my Kodak Elite Chrome color palette, which is a digital color palette. But since I'm so old school, I often you'll hear rolls of film. I don't mean that. I mean digital color palette. Light bright warning polarizer, and I handheld a one-stop split neutral density filter just over the mountain to get that light balance right in the camera. All right, let's get this adventure. Oh,
We've
go
got
ahead.
questions already. What do you mean when you say the graduated neutral density tricks the camera?
So when you put a split neutral, like in this photo, there is a split neutral density filter basically almost down to halfway in the image, right down to the base of that mountain. I have darkened the sky. It tricks the camera into thinking the entire exposure is the same, so it can get a more balanced exposure. If you've ever shot a photo, even on your cell phone, without a graduated split neutral density filter during sunrise or sunset, you probably notice if your sky looks good, your ground is very dark. If your ground looks good, your sky is too bright or washed out. By darkening the sky with that split neutral density filter, it tricks the camera into thinking it's a balanced exposure, and it actually changes the camera's shutter speed, takes a little longer exposure, and we get a balanced exposure. Great question, though. All right, moving on here. Next shot up in the series, you can see it's gotten quite a bit later. The hikers are gone, and now my flowers are no longer in sun, which I love. When the light is not on flowers, they get way more pop, more color. The sun can tend to wash them out. But that also means it's getting late in the day, and about an hour, hour and a half before sunset, I take the polarizer off. It starts working incorrectly. I put my graduated split neutral density filter holder on, and it'll hold the filter for me. And in this one, you see I went from the last photo, a one-stop split, to now a three-stop split, meaning a lot darker on top to balance light between that sky and that foreground. Again, same technique, aperture priority f20. The shutter speed you can see got longer, 1/10 of a second. I left the ISO at 200. I had just a little wind. I'm trying to slow those flowers down. And you can also see my white balance went up to 6000K. And again, that three-stop grad.
And do you lock the exposure before you add the filter?
No, you need to put the filter on first because the camera is going to re-meter. It's got to re-meter with that filter on. If you meter before you put the filter on, you're going to lock the exposure. You're going to drop the filter on. The exposure is going to be incorrect. Aperture priority means the camera is constantly trying to help you with the shutter speed. I go ahead and let it, and then I force it darker. Here's the third photo in that series, and last, as you can see, the clouds are coming in. They're going to knock out Mount Rainier, which they did. I love this peekaboo effect, though, this look here. Same technique, f20, 1/10 of a second, ISO 200, one stop dark. I often darken my photos when I'm in aperture priority. I tend to think cameras try to shoot the photos a little too bright for my liking. And the white balance went up again. As it gets later, the flowers turn, the shade light in the foreground starts to get bluer and bluer. So we have to raise up that white balance to offset that. And again, that three-stop split neutral density filter. This ended the night up here at Mount Rainier at Grand Park. It was about a 5-mile hike in, which left an epic 5-mile night hike out through this glorious meadow. You can't see behind, but this meadow goes on for a couple more miles. And that blue hour dusk time is so gorgeous in the forest. I just love night hiking. And
Where was the focal point on that shot?
Oh, that's great. Let's go back. I should have talked about focus. Focus for me is always, because I'm not focal stacking, I'm using a small aperture to create a big depth of field. Focus is always in the foreground. Now there's a flower in the center right in the front. That is not my focus point. That would be too close, stretching the lens too far. But if you count straight back from that, 1, 2, 3 purple flowers, that's my focal point, usually about 10% into the photo. I'll pinpoint on something. Sometimes I even turn on my live view and I use the zoom button to zoom in on just one flower. I use a loop viewing device for the back of my camera, and I can actually see hair on those looping, and I know I'm pinpoint focused. So great question. Always focus in your foreground. Every lens is slightly different, but I try to teach my students about 10 or 15% into that photo. We get a little what's called back focus. That's why those first flowers still look pretty sharp. But had I focused on the very first flower, Mount Rainier would be a little soft. So just a little ways into the foreground. All right, on to the next location. We've changed regions. It was about a 4.5 hour drive from Mount Rainier to the Goat Rocks Wilderness in with Mount Adams. These are the actual Goat Rocks, though, to start this shootout. And let's just do a little bit here. Aperture priority. By the way, the lens was set at 35 millimeters. You can kind of pay attention to where that lens is to see how wide I'm going. F20, 6/10 of a second, 1 1/3 stops dark, ISO 100, 5400K. When you have that late light that is just cutting across that photo there, that's got a lot of glow to it. So we usually turn the white balance down a little, 5400K. And off of that, we get some reflected light down in our foreground. So we're not getting that blue effect yet in the, and again, focal on this isn't that first fuzzy top flowers there, the pasque flowers. It would be the second grouping. So just a little ways into that. And this, by the way, is a three-day backpack, a 2-night backpack. So I got to stay out here in these beautiful meadows.
How do you determine the correct white balance?
You just look at the back of the camera. So this is one thing I ask my students, at least for their first class. Turn off the histogram or do not pay attention to your histogram. I really want you to get you in tune with you looking at the back of the camera and you making the determination on whether you have a great photo or not. Down the road, if you want to bring the histogram back in, use it as a guide, but just remember, histogram is to help you take a series of photos or a photo to be post-processed. Your eyeball will be much better at determining a photo for all in camera. And you can also see on this one, a 4-stop split neutral density filter. There's a lot of light up there on top. So we have to darken that sky even more to keep that balance. And the only way to find balance is to slide a filter in and take a picture and see if the top and the bottom look like they're both the right exposure. If my sky came out too dark and my foreground was too bright, I'd have too much filter on. If my foreground was still a little dark and my sky was a little washed out, I don't have enough filter on. It takes a little practice to get those split neutral density filters down, but once you master them, they change your photography forever. Here was the next shot. I moved locations and pointed the camera towards Mount Adams. Love that little beam of clouds heading across there. Same exact setup. You'll see F20, aperture priority, 1 second exposure, 1 stop dark, ISO 100. White balance is up a little. It's getting later, 6200K. And now instead of a straight 4-stop, I'm using a 3 and a 1 stop, and they're offset a little. Sometimes with a really dark filter like a 4-stop, you'll see the filter line. And here I wanted the filter in 2 places, one right in the cloud and one a little bit lower. That helps blend out that split neutral density filter.
And what time of year was this? What month did you go?
This is the 3rd week of July.
Nice.
All right. And so let's look at how the light changed here. This is probably about a 10 or 15 minute difference in photo here. By the way, I'm shooting 24 millimeters, which on my 24 to 105 is as wide as I can go. And when I backpack, I try not to bring another lens weight is an issue. By the way, when I left the car for a 3-night trip, my pack weighed 62 pounds. So you can see adding another 2.5-pound lens matters. All right, look at that. We're getting more into alpenglow now. Pretty much the same shot. I zoomed in just a little bit to 27 millimeters, aperture priority f20. But let's look back. Look at this exposure here. 1 second. Now I'm up to 5.2 seconds, and I'm 2/3 of a stop dark in ISO 100. White balance is 5900K, and I'm still using that 3+1 equal 4 stops on that split neutral density filter.
And what time of day do you go out to get that alpenglow?
Oh, that happens. This is probably 10 minutes after sunset, 15 minutes after, and the alpenglow got a whole lot stronger. Don't leave right after the sun sets. You might miss the best photo. Sometimes I'm out 45 minutes after sunset shooting photos, sometimes an hour. So don't leave too early. All right. And while that was going on in front of me, this is going on behind me. I literally flipped the camera around as fast as I could, set up a comp as quick as I could without moving. I didn't want to move because I liked that Mount Adams comp so good. And what really changed in this is I had to put another filter on. Now I'm pointed directly at the sun. The first shot, the foreground came out very dark. The sky was overexposed. Slap another filter, a 4+1 stop in. I'm using 5 stops to balance light. All right, now I've gone to bed and got back up early in the morning. In July, it's getting pretty dang early. And this is pre-alpenglow, so before sunrise. No polarizer on, split neutral density filter on. I'm up a little higher. I was able to put a straight 4 stop on there. Same settings, f20, 1.6 seconds, 2/3 of a stop dark. That landscape roll of film, 6200K in that white balance. After this morning, we took a bunch more shots, but I had to limit this down. I could have easily put up 100 photos, but I wanted to show our hike. So we took off for a morning hike to go hike the Cascade Crest, which is actually the Pacific Crest Trail. You don't see it in this picture, but the Cascade Crest actually is a knife's edge you're hiking on. And in one eye, you've got Eastern Washington, and the other eye, you've got Western Washington, but you have to keep your eyes down, look at your feet so you don't fall off the mountain. I have a rule: a dead photographer is not a very good photographer. So I try to stay alive. Now I've got my light bright warming polarizer back on, and I'm hand holding that 1 stop split neutral density filter over the sky to balance out this nice exposure. You see a little snowpack there in the left in a circuit. That's actually a frozen goat lake. Now we're back by camp, and we're back at the Goat Rocks, but we're up another 500 feet up the trail. That meadow still went on, and I really wanted to get a great trail shot with that glowing Goat Rocks. And you can see I use the exact same settings, f20, 0.8 of a second, ISO 100, 5600K, because there's a pretty straight line there where the light is. 4 stop split neutral density filter worked great. I just love the pops of red, and I love that last glow on the mountain. And now I'm going to shoot a sunset from up higher, quite a bit higher than the night before. And way down in there is my camp somewhere. And now we're just have a commanding look over this meadow. And same technique there. The lens was 30 millimeters, aperture priority f20, 1.6 seconds, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100. 5800K in that white balance, 4 stop split on. I use that 4 stop a lot. For my students, I just recommend getting a 1, 2, and 3 stop in hard to start. I don't want you to break the bank right away, but you can always put a 3 and a 1 together to make those 4 stops.
We had a question along those lines, actually. Why does overlapping a 3 stop and a 1 stop offset work to trick the camera, but a soft step graduated doesn't work? He uses both.
Okay, so a 3 and a 1 offset by 1/8 of an inch still leaves a pretty hard line for the camera. A soft filter, it almost starts to graduate right away from the top, and it graduates well through the middle of it. which means there's no hard line to stick anywhere, and the camera is not fooled. All it's done is darken the sky a little bit. If I was to use a soft, it would be in conjunction with a hard filter. A soft filter is never going to switch my camera's exposure, and I'm always going to end up pushing it way too far down into the foreground in order to get a dark enough sky. So for me, my personal preference and what I recommend to my students is don't need to bother with soft filters. Just use hards. I will say I have some post-processing friends who use soft filters. They're only using it to try to darken the very top of their sky a little bit. They're going to still take multiple exposures that they're going to blend together in Photoshop in some fashion. And here we go. So you can see what's happened here between this shot and this shot. Those clouds just moved right in there and filled up the valley, adding a little extra drama to this photo. All right, we've moved on from that 2-day backpack, and we've done moved to Mount St. Helens, done a 4.5-mile hike in the afternoon, scouted all around, found a spot finally after a big search that I had shot maybe 10 years before, and that is Spirit Lake. We did not have a little bit of smoke in the sky, and we did not have any cloud drama to speak of, and the wildflowers were a little poorer than usual in this location. But this is where I was, and I used the Randall J. Hodges Mountain V filter, and you can see exactly why. This is set up in that perfect V, and so a 3-stop Mountain V filter worked great, and I had to put a 1-stop filter over it because the 3-stop wasn't quite enough. And onward, looking out in the other direction from this view, about a 100-yard run to go see Mount Adams in Alpenglow. Aperture priority f20, half a second exposure, 1-stop dark. ISO is up way higher. I would never be able to make a print of this at 1,000 because it was just windy. And for me, an ISO that high means no big print. It would never make my website, but I'm still out there and I still want to capture a photo and use all my technique to the best of my ability. Now that I'm looking away from the sun, I could get away with less filter. So I dropped down to a straight 3-stop hard. We moved on to another location. That is Sheep Lake down in there. This is on the east side of Mount Rainier National Park. We've hiked up to a pass here, and we're looking back out over Sheep Lake, and to the left is Mount Adams, and to the right is Mount St. Helens. I hiked a lot further up the ridge, found a great view of Mount Rainier, but I could tell the sun was setting right behind it, that the light was not going to be good for in-camera photography. It would have taken multiple exposure blending. So I returned back to something that's in my wheelhouse, and just the 1 Alpenglow shot on this night, 4-stop split neutral density filter, f20, 2-second exposure, 1-stop dark, ISO 100, white balance 6500K. You'll see that white balance shifts around a lot. Generally, for mountain photography, that white balance is going to land between 5 and 7,000. Generally, that doesn't mean I shoot some in the 4,000 all the way up to 10,000. So I really use that white balance to try to make sure the greens are green. I'm seeing the color I'm seeing in the sky, and doing that right in the camera.
And are you using a tripod? If so, which one?
Oh, every single shot. I should have mentioned that. I use a Gitzo Traveler tripod with a Gitzo Traveler head. There's not one shot you'll ever see that is a landscape shot that I shoot that is not on a tripod. The only time I would take my camera off a tripod is to do a macro shot of a wildflower or a tulip or something, and only because it's so low to the ground, I'm practically laying on the ground. So, and plus, usually when I'm shooting macro, I'm shooting a very fast exposure. But this is a 2-second picture. You can't do that handheld. And a tripod, this is a great question. A tripod is equally important for another reason: composition. Now, if I was hand holding this shot with a split neutral density filter set up on, I'm trying to get the filter set and I'm trying to get this composition. Every single time I take a photo, it's going to be different. I'm never going to get back to my same composition. You can't see it in this photo, but I nitpicked this composition and every other composition before it to death. I set up a composition, I take a photo, I look at all four corners of the picture. Can I rebalance it? Yes. In this one, I didn't catch that Mount St. Helens was in my picture at first. My picture was more centered toward Mount Adams. But because I was on a tripod, I got to just swivel it, take a shot, move it, take a shot, keep pinpointing. Once that composition is dialed in, I don't have to move the camera. You will be a much better photographer, even if you're shooting fast exposures, if you use a tripod. Great question. All right, on to the next one. Yet another hike. We've moved away from Sheep Lake and we backpacked into Gorge Lake. My camp is down there in that photo. You can barely see a couple spots on the right side of that lake. That's me and my buddy's tents there. And we have hiked well above up on a high ridge to shoot. Believe it or not, Mount Rainier is supposed to be in this photo, but that is one of the things about photography. You don't always get the light you're looking for, but I still get out, I still show up, and who knows what I'm going to get. I always set out with an intention of a photo I'm going to get, but I keep my mind open and I shoot the light and the photos that come my way. This is aperture priority, f20, 1/8 of a second, one stop dark, ISO 100, 50, 800K, 3-stop split neutral density filter. And actually, I could have showed you 20 shots from just this foggy event that was happening. It was really spectacular. Never did see Mount Rainier, but got a whole series of great photos.
And what sort of shutter release device are you using for your long exposures?
I'm using a plug-in cable release, just an old school plug-in cable release. It doesn't have a battery in it. It's not fancy. I like a wired cable release, not a remote. Those for my students, I've just seen over time, they fail a lot. Some people show up thinking they're going to use their phone to fire off their camera. Well, now you've got your phone in your hand. You're trying to, fire off this when you might need your hands to hold a filter. You might need your hands to adjust your comp. It's a plug-in cable release is simple. I can hold it in my hand and adjust the camera while I'm firing photos, adjust my filter and fire photos. For me, it works. And when I take long star photos, I need a locking cable release. So that's what I use there. So here's another shot from that series where the sun, oh, it's coming out. It's going to happen. We're going to see Mount Rainier. No, I'm sorry. That never actually did happen. This was as clear as it got that night. But I still love this photo. It has lots of drama in it. That great heather just popping out in that foreground there. And then again, looking at all four corners of my box to make sure I don't have a negative space or a distracting space. So I moved around on this ridge quite a bit, trying to get that lake in an area that I was happy with the ridge line, the two ridges that are cutting through there in the middle. But light was making me change my composition constantly, where it was sneaking out, where it wasn't. This was a very busy photo shoot for me. I must have moved my camera 50 times in a half an hour. Oh, all right. We've moved on to yet another. Oh, and by the way, this was a one night backpack to Gorge Lake. We had to hike out, and now we've moved the rig. When I'm not backpacked in, I'm sleeping in my adventure van, Gracie, which is a 2020 Ford Transit all-wheel drive that I built into what I call my cabin. Nothing fancy, no shower or toilet in there, but it has a bed, lots of storage, and I can haul all my food in a cooler, and that's all I need. So we've gone to, this is Summit Lake. We've just poached camp. You didn't hear that from me, but I camp a lot in trailheads and parking lots, but nobody saw me there, so don't say nothing. And we hiked up for a sunset. It's about a 4-mile hike, beautiful hike up here, and we've climbed above the lake to get this fantastic view. And this is an epic series of watching light change. So I got my wide angle lens out for this one. 18 millimeters, aperture priority, f20, 1/3 of a 0.3 seconds. One stop dark. Like I said, I almost always am shooting my photos a little on the dark side. ISO up just a little bit at 160. There was a little wind. I didn't get it all the way back to 100. White balance 6400K in that landscape color palette. 4-stop split neutral density filter. You can see a pretty hard line where that light is out there. So it's easy to set a 4-stop filter right on top of it. And watch this little progression though of light. Well, let's go back and talk about composition here. You can see there's some elements that I just wanted to have in the photo. So yes, the clouds are part of the composition. I've got cloud on the left, cloud on the right over there. I've got the two Frog Mountain is right there, kind of in the center, Mount Rainier off to the right, another peak, ridgeline off to the left, couple of bare grass there on the left side of the photo. And if you look at the right side of the photo, we've got that old snag and a snag that slides out into the photo from there. And there's a lot of lichen and mosses growing down there, adding some color into this photo. And on the very left bottom corner, you can see I snuck in just a little greenery there, so it wouldn't be just rock. I nitpicked this composition a lot. I probably took me 20 or 30 photos to get it just how I wanted. And then I just let the clouds go through. So again, I could never have gotten this shot twice without a tripod. I need that tripod.
What time of day is this shot? And when the sun is setting, are you changing the white balance as it's going down?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So as we go through this little series, we'll see if I changed it on this night, but maybe when light's hitting the peak, I'm starting before this, my first shots, you wouldn't see it. They weren't as good. I was at 5,200. And as the light got later, my white balance started creeping up as I went into shade in my foreground there. So yes, the white balance, I'm always looking at it. I'm always changing it. And sometimes I miss it. I mean, the photo's happening so fast, I make a technical error. I didn't say that and I don't admit to it. All right, on to the next photo here in the series. Now you can see the clouds have changed. The light has changed drastically. A moon is trying to come out. I've had to move my composition a little, trying to chase the clouds. I've just zoomed in a little is really all I did on this. White balance actually dropped down 1 notch, but I've still got all the other settings except the exposure. You'll notice in this photo with more light, 0.3 seconds. And just a few minutes later, 3.2 seconds, getting much longer. Move on to the next photo. Getting much, it's still 3.2 seconds, but look how fast. This is probably, there's probably 30 seconds in between these two shots. And Mount Rainier's back out, the moon's gone. And then we move on to the next shot here. Oh, jackpot, hit the jackpot. The moon came out. I got Mount Rainier. Clouds have rushed back in. And look at that. I'm all the way up to a 12-second exposure. All right, already. And you'll notice I went from a 4-stop split neutral density filter to a 3. Because as we get into alpenglow, the light gets more balanced. It's less harsh. We can back off those filters quite a bit. I really, really love this photo. So out of this series, 2 of these made my website here. We'll back up a little bit. This one, and this one's actually in both of my galleries. And this one. And this one will probably end up in the galleries because I've sold a few of the prints on the website. That's usually a pretty good indicator that it's well received. All right, now we move locations again. We are so far we've done Mount Rainier, then we went to Mount Adams, and then we went to Mount St. Helens, then we went back to Mount Rainier, and now we're still on Mount Rainier, but we're on a different hike, and we're poach camp in the parking lot at Tolmie Peak, and I'm up on the summit of Tolmie Peak in Mount Rainier National Park. And this is looking straight out towards Puget Sound, away from the view. But this is where the color hit first. And I'm always attracted to color. Sometimes color dictates composition. So I'm shooting in the complete wrong direction, but a simple shot with just some alpine trees in the foreground, a 3 plus a 2-stop graduated split neutral density filter. When you're shooting right into the sun, you've got to knock down a lot of that bright sky in order to balance your exposure. And then we'll move on. Now I'm taking a side shot, and that's Mount St. Helens again, way out there in the distance. I've switched from the 5 stops of filter to just 4 stops of filter. The white balance has gone down to 6,000 K, 1 stop dark at that aperture priority f20, 1.6 seconds. And then as we continue, now this is the real view. But I just want to make note of that. Don't always get so stuck on what you think you came to shoot that you might miss other photos. Keep your eyes open. Before I even got my camera out, I scouted the whole area and I looked at where I thought the sun would land and what I might shoot. It always pays to show up a little early and scout your compositions. And actually, in this composition, I set out 3 rocks to mark my tripod. So I could run around the rest of the mountain and come right back to my tripod spot. This is aperture priority f20, 1.6 seconds, 1-stop dark, ISO 100, 5800K in that landscape roll of film, a 3 plus a 1 again. I'm offsetting the filters. I've got a 3 just below the ridge line and a 1 set down below that to blend into that shade area. And then
And
we'll
do
move.
you change the landscape color settings with different landscapes or keep it the same?
Generally, I keep it the same and I shoot landscape about 90% of the time in my photography. If you had joined us in the last webinar on fall color, you'll see I hardly ever shot the landscape color palette. I was shooting the standard color palette all the time because fall color can be so intense in color that it overwhelms the camera. So in my Canon, the standard is set up with less color pop for whenever there's too much color, which does happen. Sometimes you see a sunset, it's so intense out here in the West that even your arms are glowing red. That's going to be incredibly hard to gather up and control in the camera. So it's always good to have more than one color palette, and you use that along with a lower white balance to really contain that color. And let's move on to our next one here. So look at the difference here. 15 minutes, the sun, and I shot a whole series of fantastic photos. There's just no way I could show them all to you. But then we end up right in blue hour and everybody else is left. Nobody took this picture, which I thought was too bad. That's a fantastic photo. You can see though, that's a 32-second picture. So I'm still using my same technique, except I had to back off to F18. So I get that 32-second exposure, 2/3 of a stop dark. And now I've gone, so you watch me go from 5 stops of filter to 4 stops of filter. Now I'm down to 3 stops of filter as the light has become more balanced. And now we're going to move on to another hike on Mount Rainier. Luckily, I did not have to move my van. There are 2 trailheads out of this, or 2 trails out of the same trailhead. This is called Spray Park. The last hike to Ptolemy Peak was about 4 miles in, which left about a 4-mile night hike out. This is quite a bit further, 5.5 miles in. And actually, me and my buddy went up early and we added a couple of extra miles that scouting a higher location up behind this. And from that high location, I could see where the flower meadows were. So then we were able to return and find the flower meadow. This is a great series. It's really going to show how light changes and how scouting around in advance can help you. Because before we even arrived here, I scouted out a couple of tarns and picked one I wanted to also shoot. Found this flower meadow, but couldn't see the whole thing. Got up really high on a ridge, took a practice shot up there, decided, nope, that's not going to be my sunset spot. I'd already taken a practice shot here and I knew I liked this area better. Got back down, found a better area in the flower meadow, took this shot with early. This is probably 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. Still got that light, bright, warming polarizer on and a 1-stop grad over the top at a 5800K white balance. But the other techniques, very similar. F20, 1/6 of a second, 1-stop dark. Now, there's a point in the evening when the polarizer starts to hurt you rather than help you. I was right at that time. You can see the right side of this photo is quite a bit darker than the left side of this photo. And I tried to balance the polarizer more to the left, but then it just pulled a lighter spot on the right side of the photo. That's when you know it's time to take off the polarizer and just go to a straight split neutral density filter setup. And which I did. Right after this, I knew it was time for the polarizer to be gone, but I wanted to show you this photo because a lot of people ask, how do you know? Just look how uneven that sky is, and then you know. And the same thing in the morning. You start with graduated split neutral density filter for sunrise. You probably shoot that setup a full hour, hour and a half after sunrise before you get out a polarizer, which works best in the middle of the day. Now I'm gonna say that, but I'm going to take that back a minute. If you're down in the forest and no sky is involved, you can run a polarizer all day, but not when a sky is involved. All right, let's move through this series so you can see, and we'll pay attention to composition and lighting here. Now I'm at that tarn that I had scouted out, and I'd taken a practice photo here, so I know exactly what I wanted. And I love taking those practice photos because if I'm having a hard time refining a composition, I can go back and look at a practice photo and get that composition back. I know right where I want to stand. Once again, I marked my tripod feet, which is very helpful for me. I wanted that little alpine tree in the right-hand part of my bottom corner, and I wanted that little peninsula on the left-hand out there. I wanted that rock in the photo, and I love the way this tarn snakes its way towards Mount Rainier there. And here I've just got a two-stop graduated split neutral density filter, and you can see my sky is much smoother across the top there. So it was a good call for me to take off that polarizer. F20, 1/25th of a second, one stop dark, ISO 100. And by the way, this is about a half a mile from the other photo location. So at this time of night, I'm hot footing it. I'm really making a move between locations. Here I've just waited a few minutes and changed to another composition, shot that tarn again. Like this plenty good. The foreground is really nice with a couple of islands in there and helping frame the reflection of Mount Rainier. Just really love all in both these shots, all the details of the landscapes there. Even left of Mount Rainier, you can see that volcanic plug sitting there all red and in the reflection. And notice where I position that in the reflection right over there by that peninsula. Look at all four corners of your picture and notice more than just your main subject. A lot of people get too stuck on their main subject and they're not looking at the rest of the photo. All right. And then from there, it's a big scramble, run all the way back to the flower meadow. And you can see I got there just in time. There's just last light scooting across those lupins. And the white balance is low, be at 5600K because that's warm light. You know, when that sun's really low in the sky, that is super warm light. So we need to offset that with a cooler white balance. Now I'm not going to move my camera. You're just going to get to see a series of photos as light changes here. Look at that. There's just 3 or 4 minutes between that photo and that photo. And look how much more pop is in those lupins now as the light is starting to leave them. That purpley blue is really starting to come out. And then on to the next shot. Now we're really seeing the blue in those Texas people would say those blue bonnets are popping now. Really seeing that. And I moved up to a 3-stop split neutral density filter as I'm balancing more and more light from top to bottom. And now look at that big color change there. Now I'm getting that hard shadow line. And so you can see I've added a 1-stop split neutral density filter. You can also see the white balance is elevated to 5900K. Shutter speed has gone from fast to getting slower, 1/4 of a second, 1-stop dark in F20. On to the next photo there, a little bit later. Now I'm a 1/3 of a second, still using that 3+1. And now the light has just left. And look at that shutter speed jump up to 10 seconds. And I've been able to, now the light's more balanced. I pulled out that 1-stop, so I'm just rocking a 3-stop split neutral density filter. And my white balance, we started at 56, then 58, 59, 6. Now we're up to 6500K. And the last shot of the night, I'm up to 16 seconds, 6200K, 3-stop split neutral density filter, and a perfect balanced blue hour photo there, really showing off those lupins. It's amazing to me how much more pop you get out of your flowers when they go into shade light. What a fun night. And I still had a 5.5-mile hike back to the car. Let's just say we were that day finished with 15 miles total of hiking. And yeah, I went right to sleep. Skip sunrise, by the way. Yep, that happens. Could not get up. All right, we've moved locations. We've gone north about 3 hours, 4 hours to the Mount Baker, Mount Shooksan area. That's Mount Shooksan in the photo there. This is another poach camp in the parking lot with about a 2.5, 3-mile hike up in the afternoon. And this was a big scouting mission. Got up early, scouted. Oh, I don't know. I don't think I ever found all my tripod marks again, but I think I had 10 of them I thought I would get to during a sunset. That was a little too much to handle. But you can see that late afternoon light, the white balance is down to 5400K, but I still got good enough light to have that polarizer on with a one-stop handheld filter over it to balance that light. And you can see the same kind of technique, F20, it's 1/20th of a second, one stop dark. If you've been watching my exposure compensation, every photo's been on the dark side. And this is called, by the way, Skyline Divide. Beautiful hike. There's my doggie, Foxy. We picked her up after leaving Mount Rainier because dogs aren't allowed in the national parks on trails. And this was her first really big backpacking and hiking adventure. She's just about 2 years old in this adventure. No, a little less, 1.5 or so, been hardcore into training. And there she is starred in her photos. She's started a lot of photos since then. Uh, and you'll also see my ISO went up a little bit, so I get 1/50th of a second, so I can make sure and freeze action on the doggy. F20, 1/50th the second, 5600K. You can see the white balance has already kicked up a couple notches. Still got that polarizer and that one-stop graduated split neutral density filter on. Now the light's getting later. I've run over towards Mount, you can get both Mount Shooksand and Mount Baker. So we're back in the volcanoes here. And you can see I'm just getting that last dappled light across the flowers. I love that look. White balance up to 5800K now. F20, 3/10 of a second, one stop dark, four stop filter because now we're in shade in the foreground again, and we've got light on that mountain. So we really have to balance that light, but a nice straight line where that light's hitting. So a four stop hard worked beautifully. Just a little more zoomed in there, trying to frame a different composition. And in both these photos, all these flower photos, I'm looking at both the left and right hand corner. I couldn't get a flower in each corner in this picture. As I zoom in, I'm trying to make sure I get flowers in the corners there so there's no blank areas in there. And there's still just the last dapple of light hitting a couple of those flowers out in there. Great time to be shooting. My white balance ticked up again to 5900K, still got the four stop on, one stop dark, but you'll also see that ISO had to jump up there because these flowers are moving a little bit. I don't want that ISO up there, but as patient as I try to be, sometimes I still want to walk away with a photo. So up went the ISO. This was a hillside shot I had scoped out. I really like the density of the flowers. So again, I'm running from one location to the next, trying to shoot as many shots as I can. 6200K, a 3+1 stop. I had to get the four stop out of there so I could have one stop down at the bottom of the mountain and one pushed a little bit into those flowers where light was still hitting. ISO dropped to 200, 1/5 of a second. So you can see a little bit of movement there, especially on the left side of the bottom there, a couple of flowers blowing there. I'd actually rather have blowing flowers than shoot with a high ISO because I just can't make prints with a high ISO. Even later still, white balance, again, you'll see a pattern here. White balance is up to 6000K. 1/12th of a second, ISO's all the way up to 800, which just kills me, but I didn't want to walk away with no shot here. Now that the light is balancing out, I've dropped back to a 3-stop split neutral density filter. Back at Mount Shooksand, that was a nice couple football field run to get back in position over here for Alpenglow. You'll see that white balance up again, 6400K. Luckily, the wind was dying down. The ISO drops to 200, 0.6 of a second, 3-stop filter. All these adjustments, which for students that I'm teaching in the beginning, it's a lot. It's a lot to try to remember, your ISO, your white balance, your filters, all of that. But with practice, you look at a photo and it becomes second nature to you. I really love this shot, by the way. It's one of my favorites. I love Alpenglow when that blue line starts to push that pink up out of the sky. And a trail always leads your eye right through the photo. And you can see I've positioned the peak to be on the left side of the photo and the really strong flowers on the right side of the photo with the trail cutting from left to right. Ideal composition for me. It really just guides your eye right in through the middle of that photo. I love it when that happens. Now, back to really late Alpenglow on Mount Baker. You can see I'm up to 0.6 of a second, have that ISO a little bit elevated. White balance is all the way up to 6,400K, and a 3-stop split neutral density filter in hard graduation there. And so the thing about this one is I waited a little too long here than I wanted to, because of that moving wind with the flowers. I just wanted this shot without that ISO 800 or 1000. And while that was all going on, the sun was still setting out to the west, which I had another tripod spot. I made it over there in time to grab one sun star before I missed that and it dropped. Oh, so that was the end of the skyline hike. And that was a whole host of photos from one evening. That's that. It really pays to go scout your area beforehand and see all your locations, get to as many as you can. The more adept that you get at doing this in-camera photography, the easier it is to move around from locations. Here I've switched to another night hike where I'm poach camping a parking lot. This is called Heliotrope Ridge. I'm about 3.5, 4 miles from the car. Again, a pretty steep hike, as was Skyline Divide. And we found a really nice set of wildflowers, but not in the greatest position with the biggest view of Baker. Down lower where you could really see this, the Heliotrope Glacier, and a better view of Baker, there were no flowers. So I got up so high on the ridge that I wasn't quite happy with the composition, but I was wildflower hunting, so I was destined to shoot something with wildflowers. I do love that you can see the crevasses down there in the glaciers. This is 3-stop split neutral density filter, 6,200K on the white balance, still in that landscape roll, F20, 1 second, 2/3 of a stop dark. Luckily, the wind was really cooperating. And again, this is looking kind of north and west towards the mountain, south and west, excuse me. This is looking out over the horizon, and we just came up all that way out of the bottom of that valley. So took a lot of work to get up there, and I probably like this photo better than the photo of Mount Baker. And so onward to the next hike. This is Park Butte on Mount Baker. Now I've jumped from the north side of Mount Baker to the south side of Mount Baker, and Foxy Dog is doing a good job right there, posing for a photo. F20, 1/100th of a second, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 400 to keep Foxy still. And in this photo, we've been talking, let's go back a couple notches here just to talk about where to focus. So again, you've got that really nice group of Indian paintbrush right in the foreground there, immediate. That is not where I focused. Go straight up from that to the next Indian paintbrush, about 1/3 of the way into that. That's where I focused. And in this one, there's some Indian paintbrush there on the right. Didn't focus there. If you look right in the middle of the photo and you go to the first white flower, that was my focus point there. But if you have a subject like a Foxy Dog, you need to focus. I'm trying to focus right on her eyes in that. Really a bluebird sky day tonight on this one. Aperture priority, F20, ISO was at 400, so I could achieve that 1/100th of a second to freeze her. I've got a 2-stop split neutral density filter on.
And do you use a filter holder?
Yes, I do. Not when the polarizer's on, but you know, that polarizer comes off fairly early in the evening. I go straight to the holder, which simplifies life greatly. So highly recommended.
Is there one that you recommend?
So if you go on Singh-Ray's website, you'll see there's a Randall Hodges student kit. It comes with a 1, 2, 3-stop split neutral density filter. You can add on a 4-stop and a 1/2 stop if you like. You can add on the polarizer if you like. And it comes with a Koken filter holder, which works pretty darn good. I have switched up to, it's called Sioto, SIOTO, and I just bought it on Amazon for 32 bucks. I'm a 77 millimeter, so it came with its own, with its ring. It is set up for a drop-in polarizer, which I do not care for. So I just bought the holder, but the reason I went to that, it has a thinner profile, and on my wide angle lens, it will hold up to 3 filters without the filter holder showing up in the photo. Whereas a Koken, if you want to have all 3 slots available, add that extra slot. At 16 millimeters, it does show up a little vignetting in the filter holder. But most of my students are shooting on a Koken. So this night, this was as good as the light ever got. I'm not pointed in the right direction to get alpenglow. You can see it's side lighting on Mount Baker. Usually I would shoot one of the tarns. There's a series of tarns there. But I really liked in this photo how I could arrange the grassy little islands in my foreground. And notice how I've moved the camera just to get the tip of Mount Baker in that reflection also. Remember to look for those little details. Moving Mount Baker into one of those grassy areas would have taken a little bit of punch out of this photo. So for me, I found that to be an important detail. I went from a 2-stop split neutral density filter to a 3 because I don't have a full reflection of light there now. So I need a little more balance of light there. But this nice side light really lighten up the mountain is quite nice. I must say, if you go on my website, you'll see a host of photos from Park Butte that are just out of this world. I have this location in both my galleries, just not tonight. All right, and we moved on to the final destination of this trip. Now we've shot Mount Baker from 3 different locations. We've shot Mount St. Helens showed up in our photos from 3 different locations. Mount Adams showed up in our photos. We got Mount Rainier from multiple locations. The hardest volcano to get to in Washington is Glacier Peak. It is deep wilderness. When the short trail is open, the shortest trail to it is 16 miles. Unfortunately, the short trail was not open. Well, I should say, fortunately, that it was not open because it forced me to do a brand new hike called Glacier Creek Meadows. And right now I think I'm standing about 19 miles from the car. So it was a full day and a half of backpacking to get into this location. And this is when I first saw the mountain, it was already getting late. I just dropped my stuff, took my first shot, thinking, okay, if I find nothing else, this will be my sunset spot. I really like the way the trail cuts across the photo and then switch backs. And you can see it way out in the middle of that photo going off in the distance there. Got that warming polarizer on and a 1-stop graduated in hard graduation. 6,000 K in my landscape roll of film, ISO 100, 1-stop dark, still shooting aperture priority as always, f/20, 1/25 of a second. And this, by the way, is a 3-day backpack. So we've gone down, we set up camp, we've made it back up in time to get that last light on Glacier Peak. Really a stunning mountain. And the wilderness is just so far out there. It's just very few people now. Second day, we're hiking back up past that same location and just some really nice clouds and some afternoon light. Just had to get a couple of shots off here. Aperture priority, f/20, 1/60th of a second, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 200, 6,000 K in the landscape roll of film, 3-stop graduated split neutral density filter and hard graduation. But we were on a mission to shoot from somewhere else. So we were out scouting. That's why we were out early. And now we've climbed what's called a cinder cone, and we're well above the valley now. Another shot of Foxy Dog. The light was still good enough and she was holding still enough. I was able to keep the ISO low here. 3-stop split on top there. And we're still scouting. We got up on top of this, and from the top, we could see that there was a tarn, a small lake down on the other side. So immediately we had to get off of the cinder cone and go look for that. And there it is. And now I'm getting real happy with my composition. This added a lot to it. I love those pops of green in the middle there, which I assume became wildflowers, but it was so high, it was still too early, even though we're getting close to August. Aperture priority, f/20, 1/12 of a second, 1-stop dark, ISO 100, 6,100 K landscape. Now here's a new trick. I have a 3-stop graduated split neutral density filter on the top, and I have a one-stop split neutral density filter upside down in the reflection, so I can literally sandwich that piece of land in the center. So I'm balancing on the bottom, I'm balancing on the top. And again, if I was using soft filters, this would not work. There's no way I could pull this off. But now I'm very excited that, hey, maybe this is my sunset spot. And I found a new area, and it's totally hidden from everybody else because it's sitting behind that cinder cone. And there's the tarn, which makes a great shot in its own right. And I love the ice that goes down into the lakes whenever I can capture that. 3-stop split neutral density filter on top. Didn't have to do the sandwich because I have some land around that tarn there. Fantastic. Now I'm back to the original location behind the tarn to get that last sunset light. And a little smoky, I'd say hazy. It wasn't as strong as a last light as I'd hoped for, but I was happy that some light did hit that. And again, I'm using that sandwich, a 3-stop on top and a 1-stop upside down on the bottom. And now we're back up on top the cinder cone, looking over one of the tarns, shooting back out over the valley that we hiked up in for that sunset. And this was the only place that had color this night, end up being the last shot of the trip. Aperture priority, f20, 0.8 of a second, 1-stop dark, ISO 100, white balance, 6400K, landscape, a 3 plus a 1 again, so I can offset those filters. So I would guess the question about the softs, when I offset the filters, I guess I call that a medium. But really the graduation is only split by 1/8 of an inch, where a soft filter, the graduation is spread out by over 1 inch. So that's how it's done there. We'll just move on to a contact page here, and let's open it up for questions. Let's see how I did time-wise. All right, we made it through that.
We did really good. A couple of comments. Great presentation, beautiful images. Thank you, Randall and Singh-Ray. Okay, so when you're doing a long exposure, like a 16-second shot, I assume you're making sure there's no wind or breeze.
I'm hoping there's no wind or breeze. and when I start the exposure, there's probably no wind or breeze, but that doesn't mean it doesn't kick up during that exposure. And sometimes some cuss words come out, and sometimes I'm pacing while I'm waiting for the exposure, and I talk to Mother Nature a lot. Please no wind, please no wind, please no wind, please no wind. And patience. If you do post-processing, you can always shoot a series of exposures. You can always, shoot a very quick one for the flowers and then add a longer one for the sky. And then, a couple hours later, you might be able to put something together. That's just not the way I want to do it. So for me, patience is perfect.
And on those slower shutter speeds, do you use mirror lockup or are you shooting mirrorless?
I am not shooting mirrorless. I'm on a Canon 5D SR, and I do use mirror lockup. So I'll click the shutter once, and then it will click. I'll let the camera steady, and I'll take that second click. And by the way, I should have mentioned the other gear. So yes, Canon 5D SR, main lens, 24-105 Mark II lens. Second favorite lens, 16-35 Mark II wide angle lens. Third favorite lens, 100mm macro, and maybe one of these Singh-Ray ones, I'll do a macro class or a tulip class. And then my least used lens is a 1-400, but it's still an important lens to have in the kit. That Gitzo tripod. I went through all the filters I use, and everything I have, I should say, I have a backup to also. Sometimes these trips can get very expensive, and the last thing you want to do is be out in the field when a piece of equipment breaks. So I have a couple extra bodies, and with all that lens collection, if I break one, I still got 3 other lenses to use, a backup tripod, that kind of stuff.
And you mentioned that you tell your students not to pay attention to the histogram, to look at the back of the camera. Is the back of the camera set as RAW or JPEG?
you're looking at a JPEG in the back of the camera, but if you do the conversion I told you about and use the camera software, it's actually on the raw file. But the camera pushes out a JPEG because a raw file is way too big for it to push out. So that JPEG represents what will be on your raw file if you convert it in the camera software. That's a great question, by the way. But for those who don't know what a loop is, it's just a little device that shades the back of your camera, and it is focusable to your eye, and it is slightly magnified. I use that, and it is extremely helpful. I don't require my students get it for their first class, but if they're taking one of my bigger adventures, it is strongly recommended, because literally just a loop and being able to see the back of your camera will make you twice as good of a photographer, because your detail is so much better. So that's another piece of gear I almost forgot about there.
Let's see. So when you print your images, do you have to make adjustments to have the image like in camera, or no changes?
Yes. Yes. So if you read my bio, even though my goal is to be an all-in-camera shooter, every print medium is different, and printing is a whole nother challenge. A metal print prints, it's a dye sublimation. It prints from 5 inks. My printers here, we're in my Edmonds gallery, by the way, coming to you live from there. And in the back is my print shop. And I'm running 3 big Epson printers, a 17-inch, a 24-inch, and a 44-inch printer. The paper printer has its own adjustment for it to come out of. The 2 canvas printers, even though they're both Epson, they are different also. So those files are adjusted to come out of those printers. So printing, I'm lucky. Some people have to run profiles and ICC profiles and masks and a whole bunch of stuff to try to figure out what's coming out their printers. I've just figured out my printers. Most of the adjustments I make have to do with brightness. Some of the printers want the photo to be darkened a little bit. Some want the photo to be brightened up a little bit. So that's what most of my adjustments are. But metal prints are a different animal. With only 5 inks, the blacks can tend to not print correctly. So there are some adjustments made, but my whole goal is that it matches the back of my camera, which is very important to me, because if you come in one of my galleries, I'm going to start showing you photos right off the back of my camera. And sometimes I even sell photos off the back of my camera. So I really need those prints to try to match it as closely as possible. But that's why in my bio it says only the smallest adjustments are made so that the print matches the back of the camera as closely as possible. So that's a great question, though.
Let's see. What color palettes would you recommend for a Nikon mirrorless?
Okay, so I'll just kind of go through some of the color palettes of the different cameras. And I will say this with a caveat. Again, this only works if you're shooting in JPEG or you process that raw file in the software that came with your camera. If you open it, you do this and you open it in Photoshop or Lightroom, it's going to strip all that away unless you have a plugin for your camera. So let's start with Canon. I would set up the standard and landscape rolls the same generally, and I can only say generally because all the cameras are slightly different. I move sharpness up 1 from where it is. I move contrast up 2 from the middle, and I move saturation up 3 or 4 from the middle, depending on the Canon camera. I leave color tone and color hue alone. That would be the basic recipe. Now, if you came to me with a Canon mirrorless, we're going to have a slightly different adjustment. We might even do a sensor pull. If you came with me with a Canon 6D Mark II, that's going to be a different adjustment, but that's basically it. Nikon, basically all the cameras are the same. You would move sharpness up 1, contrast up 2, saturation all the way up, especially on the full frame Nikons, the DSLRs. They push the least amount of color, whereas the Nikon mirrorless cameras push more color now. I'm so happy Nikon, when they went to like the Z7, they put more color back in the camera. So you may not want your saturation all the way up. It more of a preference. You'll have to shoot a little bit, but that's the basic setting. Up 1 on sharpness to where it's 5. And then you'd go up +2 from the middle on contrast and +3 or 4, depending on the camera, on saturation. Very similar for Sony, but Sony is set up differently. In Sony, we would set up the landscape, the standard, and the vivid. And Sony doesn't have as big of adjustment parameter, so it'd be +1 sharpness, +2 contrast, +3 saturation, which is Sony's max. And as Sony's gone on, they've taken more color out of the camera. Everybody's in this dynamic range chase, and the only way to do that is to take some color out of the camera. And then for Fuji, because you can globally adjust all the Fuji films at once, I would go +1 sharpness, +1 contrast, +1 saturation. Fuji already puts its own kind of color magic in the camera, so we don't want to push any of that too far. But for most of my Fujis, that's a pretty good setting. Panasonic, very similar to a Sony. It's very hard to explain over the phone. Really, there is no substitution for coming out in the field and taking a class with me, so I can help you through all this step by step, hand by hand, and watch over your shoulder, help you with composition, lighting, all of that, because it all plays a part of in-camera photography. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a jump start on how to do it there. And by the way, if you go on my website, you get a full list of classes there. And in the future, for people who just can't get out and take a class, I don't know how long it's going to take, but this whole last year, I went and filmed 14 segments for a video series lesson that will be very detailed out. I was filmed out in the field. But my editor is my video guy. He's got a lot of editing to go before we can release that, and a lot of edits and cuts and edits and cuts. But eventually there'll be a 2 basic class package, which all these represents my actual live out in the field classes. One in Edmonds Beach, one at Walls Falls here in Washington. That makes up the introductory classes. And then a whole package of advanced classes, mountains and lakes, beaches, fall color, macro and flowers, and so on. So eventually keep an eye on me. You'll see those come out for people who can't get out for a lesson, and that'll be pretty detailed and do pretty good replacement for not being able to get out in the field with me.
And can you say again what file size you shoot?
So I'm shooting a 50 megapixel camera. When I convert that into an 8-bit TIFF, that represents 144 megabyte file size. If I get an order for something beyond a 40 by 60 print, I'll go back to that original raw file and convert it to a 16-bit, which will give me a 288 megabyte file size, which is just plain overkill for anything, under a 40 by 60, and it plugs up computers really fast. So I generally don't do that. And while we're on that subject, let me just give a quick little kind of run through how I handle my files. So one, I am an in-camera deleter. So I shoot a sunset. I go back and delete all the ones that are not the ones. So let's say during a sunset, I shot 50 or 100 photos. Delete, 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 delete. I bring home 5 or 10. That alone makes your life way simpler. Don't bring home 10,000 photos. Bring home the 200 best photos. I dump all of those. So I have the camera, the Canon software suite. One of those is a utility. So I plug the camera directly into my computer, and I've plugged an external hard drive into my computer. Once I turn the camera on, the Canon utility pops up, asks me if I want to download my latest photos. I say yes. I send them all to an external drive. The raw files are way too big to go all on my regular computer hard drive. So all those files, say I did a 5-day trip, they all download, and then it prompts Canon's DP4 to pop up. And my last day of shooting is right there across the bottom in a slideshow. And all the days that I've shot, those raw images are right there on the right. So I go back to my first day of shooting of that trip and got my slideshow, and I only pick my very best photos from that slideshow. Now I can see them much bigger on the screen. I have a much better idea. I do my file convert, save as 8-bit TIFF, and I save that TIFF over to my regular computer hard drive. I would consider that a publication or a print file. So let's say from that 5-day trip, I brought home 500 images. I only end up converting 100 of them over to my regular hard drive. And I suggest coming up with some sort of a numbering or lettering scheme for your photos. So all of my raw files went to the external drive in Awesome Images 2021 RAWs, and all my awesome photos, 2022, excuse me, that I've converted over to the regular hard drive go into Awesome Images 2022 TIFF files. And my scheme is done by state, date, and number. So if this trip was in Washington, it'd be WA underscore 2022 underscore 001 and so forth. I just converted some files from a trip I did Monday night. I'm up in Washington up to 937 for the year there. So that's how I do that. And then those photos in that TIFF version are opened up. Right now I have one sensor spot of dust. I plug that out. I keyword copyright the image, and then it's done. It's ready for printing. And now that same file gets an adjustment for every different print. Every different printer it might go to, with the goal of it matching what's right in the back of my camera. So there's the little spiel on how I handle my files. Oh, let's take that another step further. My raw files are on external drive. My good photos are on my regular hard drive. I have Carbonite. It's a cloud service. It automatically sees new photos on my computer. It takes it off to the cloud. I have an external drive here in the gallery that I'll plug in once a month, pull all the photos off on that, the TIFFs. And then every other month, I bring another external drive from home, pull all those photos, the new photos and new documents onto that, and take that drive home. So I'm really protected, but I sleep good at night. So make sure you're out there protecting your photos. I work hard for my photos. I'm sure you do too.
Does deleting the files in your camera card corrupt the card?
Yes and no. Another fantastic question. Glad you brought that up. So every day that you shoot, your camera opens a folder. It sticks all of today's images in there. When you erase them, it erases the images, but it leaves the folder. I do like to shoot a card till it's full because I show my customers the back of my camera. But once that card is full and I backed it up, like I said, that card needs to be formatted and erased and back to new. And the only way to get a card back to new is to format it. Once a month or every other month, you need to get all the images off that card and it needs to be reformatted. Otherwise, yes, it'll open so many folders that eventually it plugs it and it fails the card. But just, for a month or two, yes, you can delete all the photos you want. Just make sure you go back and format that card. And by the way, when you get a brand new card, you need to stick it in your camera and you need to format it to that camera. Don't just stick it in and start shooting. That card most likely will fail also. So awesome question.
Do you use a GPS device like a Garmin to help you get to locations, or do you stick close to the trail?
Well, I use my phone not to take photos, but I do use stuff like All Trails apps or Gaia to track myself in so I can get myself out. And often they have their own maps you can upload to help get yourself to location. This last year, I did buy a Garmin InReach just for an emergency, that when I don't have cell coverage, I want to be able to tell my wife that I'm safe. And if I get lost or hurt, I want to be able to send an SOS. So it's a little bit expensive, like $400 for the device. And for $12 a month, you're able to send 10 pre-typed texts, which I think is a safety issue, especially as I've gotten a little bit older, that if I'm and by myself, that may be my only way to get help. So, but most of the time I'm tracking myself these days on the phone. That's way easier than the old days of whipping out maps and a compass and try to figuring everything out. Oh God, I'm lost. Nope. Just turn on my phone. Oh yeah. Just head back this way.
Okay. I think that's it for our questions tonight. If anyone wants to reach out to you, Randall, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Got some info up here. The one thing I don't think I put up here was my actual email, which is randall@randalljhodges.com. You can see the website there, www.randalljhodges.com. You can always just direct message me right from my contact page on my website. You can check me out on Facebook, Randall J. Hodges Photography, or just Randall J. Hodges. Instagram's at Randall J. Hodges. If you go to my website, you'll see a video series tab. It's listed there as YouTube, and there's a whole series of videos of me being out in the field. They have a little bit of tips and techniques. They're not the lesson series I'm talking about, but you get a real feel for how I'm using those filters and what I'm doing. And on my website, you can call me at the gallery. My phone number's on there too. And by the way, I just want to mention, if I can do a little shameless self-promotion, on my website right now, you'll see I have my Images of the Northwest calendar on sale, $10 each, buy two, get one free while we have them in stock. You can also get my Images of the West book, which has 20 years of locations, photography tips, and all of that in there. And you'll also see we're having our holiday sale on there. So if you want to get a print or two, you'll see a lot of these prints that we just did on there. Everything's 10% off. Sorry about that. I apologize. Shameless self-promotion there.
Completely allowed. So we definitely, Randall, want to thank you again for your time this month. These images were breathtaking, and I just love all of your in-camera techniques and your so-called old school techniques. I think that you have a knowledge base that's really valuable. And so thank you so much for being here.
And I appreciate it. And guys, there's a very good chance, next November or December timeframe, I'll either do one or two webinars with Singh-Ray again as one of their ambassadors. I always like to get out and teach and help make people aware, and just, hey, try to keep that old school photography style alive. And before we sign off here, I just want to say happy shooting, happy hiking, and get out there and have some fun. And happy holidays, everybody. I guess it's that time. Merry Christmas, all that good stuff.
That's right. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.